a 2019 study, the Pew Research Center found that 70% of teens' largest concern amongst them and their peers was anxiety and depression. As well, the National Survey on Mental Health found that teenage mental health issues have been on a significant rise for over a decade. Matthew Herring, professor at the University of Limerick Health Research Institute, wrote about intrinsic motivation and its effects on mental health. Intrinsic motivation is a person's spontaneous tendencies to be curious and interested. Herring studied motivation variables on a group of athletes to gauge their mental state and found a significant link to mental health as an outcome of motivation. These connections and research and perspectives show definitive adolescent health concern, and this leads to a question. How is the degradation of intrinsic motivation impacting the mental health of high school-age adolescents? It's clear that through societal pressures, a lack of intrinsic motivation in American culture is negatively affecting the high school-age demographic through decreasing mental health. A significant piece of American culture is athletics, but their impact on adolescent mental health through loss of intrinsic motivation is a societal concern. George Orwell, a prominent writer and social critic, found that a game itself has little meaning unless you do your utmost to win. His analysis of sports culture is from the late 1940s and could be considered irrelevant without the correlative context that Stephen Cooper, associate professor in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, found, that sports have become a tool to briefly imagine bigness and prowess. Cooper and Orwell both circled the same conclusion, that the nature of sports has changed. And their words center on why people choose to participate in sports and the degradation of that over several generations. Instead of engaging for intrinsic motivation, Orwell and Cooper surmised that participants feel pressure to win as a result of widely accepted athletic culture. This issue Cooper attributed to adolescent sports as well. By high school, it's extremely likely that they've already engaged in this sort of environment. As Dr. Sakin Guan, professor of nursing at the University of Milwaukee, wrote for a research study on adolescent impressionability, it's environmental detriments that lead to youth health risk behaviors. The connections between Orwell, Cooper, and Guan paint an alarming picture. In the absence of intrinsic motivation, already missing for decades, sports devolve into a toxic environment that lead to mental health concerns in adolescents. The American public education system faces millions of adolescents per year. And despite it being that well spread, the Pew Research Center found that 66% of those surveyed believe that it needs systemic change and reform. And part of this call for institutional change may well be due to the mental health of the students. As the American Psychological Association found in a 2005 to 2017 dataset, those ages 12 to 17 had seen a 52% rise in depression in just over a decade. And this information supports the evaluation of Dr. Eric Rawson, Director of Professional Development Standards for the National Association of School Psychologists, of which he says that all schools have students struggling with mental health problems. It's then obvious that mental health education is a problem that must stem from a common cause. As Dr. Kadivaran, professor and head of Department of Psychiatry at Puyar University, found, it's academic stress and its effects that are essential to determining the mental health of students. While Kadivaran calls stress a regular factor of life, he explains that academic stress can be sourced from high-pressure education environments and the need to perform to a certain standard. This explanation shows an inherent lack of intrinsic motivation for students in high-stress environments. Dr. Rawson provided a correlative analysis that students struggling psychologically cannot thrive or learn to their potential. From there, it's clear that lack of intrinsic motivation in high school academics creates high-stress environments, causing students to struggle psychologically and in turn struggle academically. Adolescents and young adults have been stated as extremely impressionable in an earlier study by Dr. Guan. This overlap age is when many key decisions are being made on the future and education, and being the most impressionable age group is a concern considering the same age group has the consistently worse mental health. It's important to recall that this is when adolescents begin determining plans for their future adulthood, more than just their own influences are then weighing in on those decisions. In a 2017 study by Asma Shiikazi, Doctor of Philosophy of Education at Lara College for Women University, 432 students were selected from public education in Lara City. Students were asked to explain what external pressures had the most influence in their college and career decisions. The results showed that parents' influence was the most significant, followed by peers, print media, financial reasons, interest, and others. With interest being so far down the list, it's clear that intrinsic motivation is not largely incorporated into adolescents' career making and future planning decisions. As previously established, intrinsic motivation has ties to mental health of adolescents when they engage with psychologically damaging aspects of society. Planning for the future with external expectations is no exception. This impressionable age group is more likely to be influenced by others regarding these important decisions. However, as Kazi's study found, external influences are generally outweighing intrinsic motivation. And without intrinsic motivation, external pressures, in this case for future planning, are psychologically damaging to the mental health of high school-aged adolescents. Despite evidence that degradation of intrinsic motivation through American culture is worsening the mental health in adolescents, many still argue that these cultural institutions are purely beneficial. Alicia Garcia Falgueres from the Netherlands Institute of Neuroscience argues that physical activities such as sports can improve metabolic and cognitive functions. This research makes a case for current sports culture, but it ignores the concerning effects the previously mentioned scholars Orwell and Cooper analyzed. While sports can have positive psychological effects, there's also disastrous psychological effects, and comparing these arguments makes it impossible to say that athletic environment is entirely beneficial to adolescents. Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, made a relevant point to this in a letter that he wrote on the nature and place for sports. As he discussed, sports are a fine part of society to engage in, but not if they degenerate into the sole end of anyone's existence. Roosevelt's words apply to all aspects of culture degrading intrinsic motivation. Whether it's sports, academic stress, or external pressures on important decisions, arguments for the good of these can be singularly refuted by the point that he makes. As soon as a part of society or culture devolves into impacting a person's well-being and existence, it becomes problematic. By that argument, it's clear that culture affecting intrinsic motivation in adolescence must be reformed. The decades-long rise in adolescent depression rates signifies an ongoing issue in American society. High school-aged adolescents being the most affected is troubling, but in turn preventable. The most logical overlap of potential solutions is systemic education reform through a series of state laws adapted to best fit public schools across the country. This could affect physical education programs, intrinsic motivation in choosing academic subjects to study, and further emphasis on intrinsic motivation in important decision-making despite external pressures. The implications of this would include improved intrinsic motivation and therefore mental health of high school adolescents. However, there are obviously some limitations, which would include the legal process, education funding, and of course finer details as a result of further studies on this issue. The links between intrinsic motivation and mental health are all fairly recent, and this specific limitation has led me to a better solution. Before education reform regarding athletics, academics, and external pressures can be implemented, specific studies on adolescent environments and what creates the best amount of intrinsic motivation must be done. The implications stay the same, but the largest limitation would be research funding and having those findings formally published. However, this would be a necessary step in solving this issue. But with further research leading to education reform, intrinsic motivation can be reinstituted and the mental health of adolescents salvaged.
Okay, great. Elise, thanks. I want to ask you two questions. The first one, how did you select the strategies you used to gather information or conduct research, and were those strategies effective?
Yes, my strategies to conduct and find a conclusion to my research were extremely effective, and part of what they included was first finding sources that were linking intrinsic motivation and mental health, and from there I was able to look through the sources they used and find further examples and a more in-depth analysis of this issue, which was able to form my conclusions and overall argument.
And the second question, how did you use the conclusions and questions of others to advance your research?
Well, one of the conclusions of others that I used specifically was from Eric Rawson's study on athletes and mental health. And his conclusion was essentially that there are these links between intrinsic motivation and mental health in specific environments. And from there, I was able to say that instead of simply needing reform, which was through his overall conclusion and solution, there was a more specific way to attack the issue of adolescent mental health, which would be through a form of education.
Great, thanks.